Hello and welcome back to Mandibil. Okay, after my recent videos on my scope of my philosophy, I have actually now decided that I will actually go through all of my actual philosophy. Actually, that's a lot of actual, right? So again, we have the overview that you have seen before with ontology, external world determination, epistemology, humanology, objectology, and ethics. I haven't the particular humanology and objectology. I haven't done them yet, but as we approach that time when they arrive in the structure here, I will have done something that hopefully makes sense, right? And I really encourage you to give me your comments and your, feedback, whether or not you think this makes sense or I'm missing some points and so on. And thanks again to Johnny Isometric for, even though I'm a bit skeptical or critical about some of your questions, right? But still, that's better than nothing. So as long as it's sort of, it has an air of seriousness to it, I'll take any question and answer it as best as I can, right? Okay, this is my philosophy. As I call it, this is my, in parentheses, because it's my philosophy, but it could potentially also be somebody else's philosophy, or at least some part of it, right? So it's not like, no, you don't look at this because it's only mine and you can't use this. It's not like that, right? But I still have to say it's my philosophy. It's what I'm going to do. So we don't have to agree necessarily, right? I can still, if you have your way of doing it and you want to go your way with your philosophy, more power to you, man, right? Or woman. I mean, that's your decision. I'm just bouncing my ideas against you. And I hope that you want to reflect and see, am I missing something? Is there a problem? Is there a contradiction? Is there something, bad thinking, bad reasoning? Is it stupid? Or, something like stupid. But you know what I mean, right? Small things, large things, doesn't matter. Even the smallest things can turn out to be the most important thing. There might be, are you sure about that little word there? And it could turn out to be the most important aspect of my philosophy. I had just ignored it or not recognized that, right? So don't think you have to revolutionize everything in order to get somewhere within your philosophy or for my philosophy. I think there is a tendency, particularly among modern academics, that they think something like this: because there has been done so much philosophy during the last 3,000 years, except for the 1,000 years of Dark Ages with Christianity, which basically halted any progress, right? But that aside, so I can't make sense of how things are going because it's just too cumbersome with all this philosophy I need to dig into and have a grasp of and combine into something functional. So I'll create my own little pet subject over here, and then I'll brain fuck it into oblivion, right? I saw an interview or part of an interview on Essentia Foundation. What's it called? What is it? Sobbing? Not submit. I'm getting old. I'm subbing the channel on YouTube, right? There's a new interview with a guy, I think he's called Schooler, but I'm not sure. He talks about 3 dimensions of time, right? I mean, and time is flowing through you, and it's like, give me a fucking break, youth. Right? Then they inflate, take a little subject, and it hasn't been settled yet, and then they brain fuck it into oblivion, right? Creating two new dimensions, and they're flowing through you, but you can't see it, and you know, it's like, I mean, give me a fucking break, right? And it's only this little, you know, little detail that is, I remove everything else, and I only look at time, and then I create two new dimensions, and it's like, get the fuck out of the way, moron, right? I mean, while Rome is burning, and Nero, they're playing the fiddle, right? They're saying, let's play some, you know, pool at the pool table while Titanic is going down, right? I need to figure out if the cloth on this table should be bluish or greenish, right? Because we need to have dinner. No, the fucking ship is going down, man, right? Oh, these moronic academics, right? Okay. So, my idea is to take each of these 6 boxes. 6 so far. There might be more. I might need to get rid of one. Who knows, right? But I'll take it as it goes, right? But I'm not going to go... I'm going to take it sort of stepstone-y kind of approach to my philosophy here. I don't need to go deeply into the matter and sit there and do it. I'm telling you what I do and then what my result was. I'm not going to sit. I'll get back to it when we start on ontology, right? But there's a certain detail level I need to establish. And it might vary a bit depending on where we are or where I am in my philosophy at that actual moment, and what makes sense and what is useful for you to listen to. But it can't be too detailed, because then I'll lose track of what I'm doing, and you'll lose track of what I'm doing and where you are in this kind of thinking. So it's a good idea to keep this sort of a little bit of a helicopter view of what you're doing when you're doing philosophy. And this zooming in and zooming out and zooming in and zooming out of your philosophy, that ability is not the worst thing to have if you want to do good philosophy. And this is what also I criticize about academics is they zoom out and sit here and is lectured by their professor, and then the professor tells them, then you have to zoom in on a subject, and then you have to stay there for 40 years, and then you get your pension, right? And then you sit there and create 2 new dimensions of time, right? Nobody can use it for anything. I mean, it's ridiculous. Shut the fuck up, man, right? Well, you know what I mean, right? Okay. So, zooming in and zooming out, don't become a nerd, because nerds sort of tend to stay down in the details. Zoom out a bit, see what have I done, right? What have I done? What the hell have I done, right? And then maybe get back down in the details and, get out a bit and see the overview and how does it fit together and so on. Right? It's like the difference between the construction worker and the engineer and the architect. Architect have the big overview of how things should be put together. The engineer has a more practical view of, okay, there should be a worker over there and we need to do this here, and the project manager makes sure that everything happens at the right time and the right place with the right tools and the right, whatever effort and time used. And then the actual worker, so to say, the guy doing it or the girl doing it, is just focusing on that detail and doing it, right? So there's sort of these layers of working with your philosophy, and you have to sort of zoom in and out of this, in my opinion, right? It's just sort of a abstract approach to thinking about this, right? So when you're doing philosophy, in my opinion, it's a good idea to have this kind of overview that I have here. The scope of my philosophy. Where am I going? Because if I'm presenting it to you, if I'm not strict about what I'm trying to do, I'm just starting somewhere and throwing words at you. You basically have no idea necessarily where it leads. And 5 and 6 and 7 hours down the road, you can't remember what was spoken of at the 30-minute mark and so on, right? So I make sure that you don't lose overview of what I'm doing. And this is a very, very, very good indicator, in my opinion, whether or not the one presenting his or her philosophy has actually done something useful and have a good grasp of what they're actually trying to do, right? I don't believe in, I refuse to, I don't like the term belief, but I refuse to accept that philosophy is something that you have to spend your whole life doing in order to just get to a definition of knowledge. I simply refuse to do that. And I think it's because it has become an academic, it has become some kind of academic venture where academia is making sure that you don't get to a result. Because if you get to a result, it's like the construction work I mentioned before. If the engineer can say, well, it will take, I don't know how many years to build this, and you have to keep giving me money. I promise you we'll finish at some time, but I don't know when. But it'll be great, right? And then you pour money into this. Well, if this guy wants to keep doing this, his construction work as an engineer, he doesn't actually want to finish, because the cash flow will end the moment he finishes doing this. He just has to present, the Emperor's New Clothes. He has to present something that looks like he's going somewhere. And then they'll probably do some fancy mathematics or some elaborate 5-dimensional diagrams nobody understands and say, look, we have come to some intermediate result here. It's going great. Send us more money, right? One good example is this, what's it called? This, that Bernardo Kastrup is he likes so much this Italian guy who does, I forget what the fuck it's called, information integration, the information integration theory, I think it's called, right? And it's ridiculous, right? It's like, I mean, you can try to wrap your head around it. I don't want to go into any kind of description because I'm not even sure what the fuck they're doing, right? But it's such a academic make work, as I called it. I'm going to create something that looks like it's very important, but I'm basically just creating a perpetual construction site where I can keep that money flow going, so I can keep my sort of professorship or my engineering position. I'm not going to finish it. Actually, I'm not building anything. It's the Emperor's New Clothes. They're creating illusions, pretending it to be something useful, right? They're not building anything. They maybe have a few piles of bricks and some mortar running over there, and then they have created a PowerPoint show that show this is how it's going to look, something like that, right? Just send us more money and wait a couple of years, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. Okay, so it's a good idea to understand that in order to do good philosophy, in my opinion, you have to take control of the terms used or that you use in your philosophy. Now, I'm not sure I will be 100% perfect in my use of terms, right? Because I have to use terms in order to describe that I'm going to use terms. So just so it doesn't become this awful, stupid kind of, you have to start somewhere if you want to present it, right? It's not like, as soon as I start presenting it, I need some definitions, but I can't have the definitions before I start presenting it, and so on. If you really dig down, I mean, everything possibly gets into a circular argument if you really want to, right? So you have to accept something in order to get somewhere. So you have to have some kind of idea of language in order for me to, you know, enter your mind, right? So I guess you have to have that kind of axiom. Whatever axiom you need in order to understand what I'm doing here, that's what I take for granted so far, right? So when we get to the deep end of the ontology, I'm saying that this is where you take control of your definitions. If you take in a new term, the new term has to be identified only by what you have already established. And each time the establishment within the ontology, I'll get back to that very soon. This is where you point out what the starting point is. And everything has to evolve from that. If it doesn't, you should tell me. I mean, I'm not ordering you around anything, but you should be aware and be critical. And, you know, say, what's up with that? Are you sure that works? Because I don't see, you know, it connects and so on and so on and so on, right? And that's also why this waterfall construction or diagram I've created here, they are connected, but they are waterfall. They're not falling upwards, right? They're falling down. So each time you get down a step here, you are dependent on all the prior steps. You can't just invent some floating step somewhere, right? So it's interconnectedness. And the ontology itself has an interconnection, which I described earlier in my A, B, C levels. And that hasn't basically changed so far, right? And that's also what I'm going to introduce to you once again in the next slide, or a few slides ahead here, right? So I'm just trying to establish various algorithms for doing my philosophy that sort of keeps myself on track, so I don't do something that I don't think I'm allowed to. If somebody start, hey, this is my philosophy, and then they just start to throw words at you, be very careful that they don't set themselves these limitations. I have to work with this kind of meta-philosophical rule, or what you want to call it. I have this rule when I reach that kind of point. I have to do this, I have to do that, and some kind of rationality for why you choose to do it that way, which is sort of, as I say, in order to make it rigid and backward controllable, or, you know, you can change it. You can check if it's, you can go backwards and check if it's functional. From that definition goes back to that word that has this definition, that goes back to these words that has those definitions, and so on, and back to the reduction base. I never venture out into the blue and say, okay, now I'm establishing a world over here and I'm going to tell you about it. No. It has to be established from that original reduction base. That's why I do it. So I don't go anywhere and inflict something on you that is ridiculous, right? I don't just start with throwing words up in the air and say, hey man, I'm a philosopher. I have this, you know, PhD. Look at my papers, right? Fuck you, man, right? So, and not you, but that stupid academic over there, right? So this is basic structure. There might be a few more rules there, and I get back to them when I get there, maybe, right? So, but another thing, and that's the next slide I'll show you here, which is the dilemma thing that I showed you with the external world decision, which is, if you can't get to it, you need to figure out, in my opinion, a way to approach it. You can't just say, well, I don't know, and then pretend that you can argue by throwing words up in the air, right? Like most, if not all, philosophers do. They just, it's like they say, well, I have to get there, so I have to throw words at it. At some point, I have convinced myself I have actually argued for it, but when you scrutinize the argument, it's either so fluffy that you have to reject it, or it's filled with errors of some kind. This is, in essence, this dilemma solution, this risk assessment approach, is actually saying, I am the one making the decision. You don't have to do it this way. If you want this axiom, for instance, to be no, if I say yes, that's perfectly fine. That's up to you. My risk assessment is from my point of view. I'm using my abstractions and feelings and emotions and rationalization to come to a conclusion that I'm going with. I just have to stick with it, in my opinion. I can't say yes axiom here, and then when I get down to epistemology, the axiom is all of a sudden no. No. It has to stay the same. At this point, there's a fork in the road. It will be yes or it will be no. Whatever I choose, that's carved in stone. But I'm aware that I have to make the choice. And I'm very clear about how I do it. I'm not arguing for anything. There's no logic or any reasoning or any deduction or anything like that involved. It's purely from my subjective, maybe you could say emotional point of view. How do I feel about the combined risks here? Would it be a yes or would it be a no based on the risk? Right? And another thing is, these kind of dilemmas might be more like a trilemma or a quadrilemma or whatever the fuck they're called, right? And there might be, I don't think there will be a yes or a maybe and a no in the axiom side. That will usually be a yes or a no. Otherwise, the dilemma, the matrix here doesn't work. That's a gray area, and that I would probably need a different, but I'm not ruling out that there could be, it's not a yes-no situation, but there are 5 different choices, right? And then I could make an axiom based on these 5 different choices, and then the X would up there would be the same maybe, or that would be 2, so that would be 10 risk assessments. It doesn't necessarily have to be a 2x2. It could be a 5x2 or a 2x3 and you know, whatever. It's just I call it dilemma. I think it's 2, but if there's more than 2, it's not a dilemma, it's trilemma or something like that. But never mind that, you know, linguistic thing. I just call it a dilemma risk assessment, no matter how many boxes are in the matrix. These dilemma risk assessments are used in cases where I can't get further without creating something because I need it, not because exactly because I cannot argue for it, or it doesn't follow, or it's not deductible, or whatever the situation is. Then I have to do something like this. And this might actually be needed much more than I actually realize, or anybody else realizes. It's possible whenever something is hugely inflated within general academic philosophy, it's possibly because they should have done a dilemma risk assessment instead of trying to throw words at it and hope that some conclusion arrives, right? So I think that's, for now, it's enough to say, okay, I'm trying to take one thing at a time, and I have some rules for how to do it. That should be enough so far to get on with it, right? Okay, so I'll get to the next slide here, and we are dealing with ontology. And I've created a whole presentation on ontology, on my ontology, in this ABC rule, which I will link below if you want to go and check that out, to get some more details maybe than I'm presenting here. But the whole idea is both to describe my result and then my approach, right? The approach is the one to the right, and the result obviously is the one to the left, right? and it's similar to the ones I have shown you already in this series. So there's nothing really new under the sun here, right? Okay, so how do you approach doing ontology, and why do I need it? Well, I need it because it's, in my opinion, I have to find a starting point. Where would I start? Well, in my opinion, it's a good idea to start with your phenomena. What is actually in the toolbox, so to say, right? Then I can maybe categorize and do shit afterwards. But maybe I should just look at what I have to work with, right? That's sort of my approach. And in my opinion, an ontology is basically just a mapping, you could say, of my phenomena. And there's a bit more to it, like, you know, categories and interdependencies and so on. But I'll get to that. It's basically just forgetting everything, all the dogmas, all your philosophy, all what you're supposed to think, try to put it aside. And purely, you know, like you're you know, making order in your cutlery drawer or whatever, right? Or your sock underwear arrangement, and you know, it's just like this has to go there, this so just mindless categorization and you know, observation kind of, right? Try to be as little prejudiced, if not completely unprejudiced. So just, you know, be observant, right? So one way to do this is just to describe everything, right? Everything that you have, and describe it as meticulously and diverse as you can. Because it's not just, well, there are bottles and there are computers and there's a tree outside, and you know, but what about the color, right? And what about me philosophizing? Is that a part of the ontology? You have to get as deep as you possibly can and describe all aspects, right? Okay, when that is done, maybe put it aside for a few days, get back to it and try again. And maybe put it aside for a few days, get back and try again, right? And at that point you might have to, oh, I forgot there's actually this kind of phenomena also, I need to write that down, right? You don't need to write all the animals in the universe, right? You can sort of say, okay, there's the beavers, the elephants, the lions, and they sort of have something in common. They are what are usually called animals. I just told you not to be prejudiced. But it's like, okay, do I need to write, there's this kind of beaver, then there's Canadian beaver, then there's a South American beaver, you know, right? It's like, you can sort of make a long list and say, okay, I think I've covered this sort of category of items, right? And you're already going into categorizing things, because it's easier than just keep writing a long list that is sort of unending, possibly, almost, right? How many animals? Are there 10 million animals, and 8 million of them are insects, right? Insects is the most successful category of animals on Earth, I believe, right? God must be very, very fond of insects. It's possibly unavoidable that you will get to a point where you can't go on doing this description of these phenomena without actually creating these categories. It just comes natural, at least it does for me. So I'm saying, well, these are this kind of the animals and so on, right? But there are also colors and sounds and tastes and touches. That's also a phenomenon. If there's a taste of something that you really like cherries, for instance, right? The taste of cherry. That's also a kind of phenomena, right? It's not, you're not tasting the cherry. It's not the cherry that is the taste. There's also something you recognize as the cherry before you taste it. And it has a color, and it has a shape, and all these things. So identify all of them, right? Just keep going as deep as you can, as I said before. But inevitably, in my opinion, you will end up with some categories. Then identify all the different categories you can, right? And just do it by similarities and differences. There's some similarity between a beaver and a rat, maybe, right? So they're sort of in a specific category, so to say, right? And they're different from the other ones. There's a difference between a cat and a color, right? So colors are over here and cats are here, sort of, right? So a pattern might emerge within your description of your phenomena, right? So try to categorize all of these phenomena. Try to categorize them. There shouldn't be any. There might be a category with only one phenomena in it. I'm not ruling that out. Maybe. But then create categories and make sure that all of your phenomena is in a category. If you have category, that is. But I suspect you would have, right? Then, we're getting more and more interesting now, right? Now, when you've done that, try to figure out if there is some interdependencies between the categories, right? Do you always, for instance, need a color in order to have a cat? Will the appearance of the color, is that necessary for there to be a cat? Right? And it's what is difficult about this particular step is that I can think of a cat without there being a cat, right? And if we get a little further down the road in a quick step here, right? This is an aspect of how cognitions work, in my opinion. And cognitions is one of my categories, right? I have these three categories. There are subcategories, yes, sure. But the major categories. So this is my structure. This is how I organize my ontology. Or my ontology is this is how I organize my phenomena, I should say, right? So I would suggest that you don't you put aside the ability to think of an elephant as opposed to experiencing an elephant. Think of it as experience only, and then add to that story the idea of being able to imagine an elephant. But you could then say, okay, but since I can imagine an elephant, there must have been some ultimate first step of me experiencing an elephant that might maybe make me able to imagine an elephant. If I hadn't experienced an elephant, I wouldn't be able to imagine an elephant, right? But we're going back to sort of Plato's forms here and the blank slate of what he's called, the British guy, right? Locke. The blank slate, or you know, and these kinds of ideas. It's an old problem. And it's possibly has something to do with genetics and how the forms, what they call the my English is bad today. Concepts was the word I'm looking for. A concept is the empty form, in my opinion, that allows you to cognize. I have an empty form, Platonic form, that is elephant. I can tap into that idea of elephant or the concept of elephant without actually experiencing elephant. But I use that concept, or my mind uses that concept to cognize elephants. If it didn't have that, it couldn't cognize it, and I couldn't tap into it, right? Without, it's sitting there as an empty shell of elephant, so to say, awaiting when elephant is a part of my experience, and then say elephant, right? But that idea, that Hume's, the weak idea and the strong idea that he worked on, right? I'm paraphrasing a bit here, right? But the strong vivacity and the weak vivacity, right? That the strong vivacity is when you actually experience the elephant, while the weak one is when you're tapping into the idea of the elephant, right? Okay, so that's a lot of work we have already done here, right? So structurizing the order of the interdependencies. You have to, all of the categories have to fit together. So if you have a couple of categories over here that are interconnected, and then you have another set over here that are interconnected, how does it all work together? So try to fit everything together in one picture. How do you do that? Well, my approach is that you do something like Cartesian doubt using definitions, right? You take something and say, how is that defined? I take elephant. How do I define that? And define that, and then define that, and when do I stop with that definition? You can even write that process down. And then you can do that for a lot of phenomena. And then compare these strings of definitions and see what's the bottom end of this string of definitions. That's probably where my reduction base is, because if I'm defined, I must be able to stop somewhere, say this is the starting point of all definitions. Or otherwise I can just keep going and keep going and keep going, and then I possibly in some kind of definitional circle. That wouldn't work. So I have to make definitions that stop somewhere and say I can't define any further, right? When you have all these descriptions of definitions, if there seems to be somewhere it tends to end, that's probably a starting point. And also a starting point of interdependencies of categories. There's sort of a connection between these interdependencies and your ability to define things. So by defining things, you're finding the starting point. And then you kind of forget these definitions, right? It's like I am using the definitions to get to a common undisclosed starting point. But when I have that starting point, I forget these definitions I just used to get there. So this is sort of a tricky exercise, right? It's because I'm using a potential embedded reduction base in my approach to defining words that is sufficiently strong in order for me to identify what it is. And then I can get rid of these definitions I just made, or strings of definitions. And then find that starting point, and then place all the categorical or category interdependencies from that starting point. And that starting point is my reduction base. This is where it starts. And it's as I say here, it is the starting and reference point for all further philosophy. So you better do this well, right? Because everything else is going to suffer from it if you don't do it well. I don't think there's necessarily one way to do it. I like big categories. You might end up with an ontology that has 27 categories. That's up to you. I like big categories and then maybe shave up a few, I lump everything into abstractions because of a particular approach, right? So what I have come up with is this: A, B, and C categories. In the A category, which is my reduction base, I have color, sound, smell, touch, and taste. At some point, whenever I try to define something, I always, without exception, have to refer back to some color and or some sound and or some smell and or some touch and or some taste. It's one of them or two of them or three of them or all five of them maybe, right? Depending on whatever it is. It seems that at the end of things, it always sort of converges towards one, at least one of these. And another point I might make is that, in my opinion, for me to say that I can actually cognize something which is the next category, and maybe I'm a little premature here, but I always have to have a color. It's not a true cognition if I don't have color. If I'm sitting in the grass and I'm hearing a sound and it's a roar, I say that's a tiger. But it's more like I'm tapping into the idea of tiger and a memory of how it sounds than I'm actually cognizing tiger. But it might be advantageous for me to be able to do it so I can get away from it before I actually cognize it. Because if I cognize it, it might be much more dangerous than just tapping into the idea of it and get out of the way, right? So, there are 5 categories or types of qualia. I don't want to call for instance, color a category. It has variations, but it's still a color. So it's not a category, it's a particular kind of within that category, of which there are 5 in that first one. I call the qualia. That is a standard term used, right? So there are colors, there's sounds, there's smells, there's touch, and there's taste, which is CSSTT. That's how I remember it when I have to recall them, right? CSSTT, color, sound, smell, touch, and taste. And there's also a reason why I order them in that order, which is they are categorized here according to their perceived distance of cognition, or of appearance, distance of appearance. I'm not sure what term to put on it, but if I see something, I can see it. Basically, I can see, potentially, supposedly, stars that are 13.7 billion, whatever, light years away or whatever, right? That's within the understanding of my perceptual realm. That's a very long distance. Sound is much closer. The scope of sound is the distance or the periphery of potential sound cognition. Maybe I'm not sure, but I hope you understand, right? Is shorter, and smells are even shorter. And touch, you actually have to, by definition, it has to be at you, right? And taste is even closer. You have to put it inside you, right? So it's like it's ordered according to distance. And I also think that there might be something about this order and how much importance we, in some, it's sort of a fluffy thing here, right? But people put much importance into how things look, right? Just think about it. I mean, I'm an old hi-fi, nerd, right? Or not exactly nerd, but in the old days, in the 90s, I did like a good stereo and so on, right? I have sort of lower level of interest now, right? But one of the things that was for hi-fi nerds it's not about how it looks, but the mainstream approach to selling hi-fi equipment was, Bang & Olufsen, which is a famous Danish B&O, right? They sold their equipment on how it looked. And they sold a lot of shit, right? But when you listen to it, it didn't sound nearly as good as a hi-fi nerd equipment that at half or third the price, where everything, all the money had been put into creating sound, while Bang & Olufsen spent at least half of their money creating something that looks good, right? But when you think of it, and hi-fi equipment is not there to look good, it's there to sound good. But since you have to look at it also, you can't, right? But just it's sort of, but it still should be more important how it sounds than how it looks, right? But when we're discussing that, there's an old, joke within hi-fi, nerddom, right? Which is the WAF, which is wife acceptance factor, right? Which is an appeal to how well would this equipment be accepted by your wife, who's only into how it looks and how much space it occupies, right? So if it's a big fat speaker that is sort of a tower, with half, 3 foot by 6 foot or something, whatever, right? With 3 bases, and it's like it has a very, very low WAF, right? Okay, enough of that shit. It doesn't hurt to be a little funny at times, right? So this is my approach to doing this first step of my philosophy. And I think it's not the worst I could do, what I have come up with here, right? Because I have qualia, which is a particular kind of phenomena. I have cognitions that always seems to depend at least on one qualia. And that could be elephant, beaver, apple, hand, train, right? But I will have, and you could just keep going with the cognitions. I mean, if you listed all your cognitions, right, that would be a hell of a lot of them, right? Okay, so I'm just mentioning some here that elephant, beaver, and apple, and hand, and train. These are sort of sufficiently diverse to point out the potential sort of differences, but they are all of them dependent on some qualia, right? So then there's the last, which is everything else. And why I've put everything else in there is that everything else is in one way or another dependent on the first two. So they must be of some kind of, compared to those of second order. And I'm lacking a better term maybe. But they are so dependent on these first two that they have to be of somewhat less importance in establishing rest of my philosophy, in my opinion. Because these two categories are so fundamental. This third one, which is huge, right, are all there because of the first two. So they are second order in that sense, right? But the first two are so closely linked that I put them together in a sort of they almost work as one category. You could have a category 1 called A and B, and category 2 called C, right? It's almost like that, but not quite, because they're still very, very, very different. A color is completely different than beaver, right? But they work, in my opinion, very closely. I mean, as soon as I pan my vision there are colors and sounds and maybe not taste because of the aforementioned distances, but colors and sounds, right? And everything is cognized. My post box and the neighbor's house and the tree, right? It's like that. They're very closely linked. But that I remember I have to check the mail because I saw the mailbox. That's what it's not called a post box, they call it a mailbox. Because I saw the mailbox, I might be reminded, I need to go and check the mail. That's an abstraction, right? I didn't experience my need to go and check my mail. It was because I saw that mailbox, which is composed of some white colors and maybe some shapes, and I might before I go, leave you with it, address the idea of shapes. So it's a derivative of the first two. That's why I shove everything else down in a huge category called abstractions, because they're all one way or another. If I took all my definition or my categorical definitions that I mentioned before, all of them has sort of this point where they become a derivative of the prior ones. And it's the same step, in my opinion, because it's all the time there has been a qualia and cognition, and then an abstraction, qualia, cognition, and then something else, qualia, cognition, and then something, qualia, cognition, and then something. It might even just be because I recall something, like I have a memory of qualia cognition. I remember, I sit here drinking my coffee and I suddenly remember, oh, mail yesterday, because I sat here, I was reminded of something I did yesterday. I drank my coffee. Okay, yesterday when I drank my coffee, I recalled that I had to go pick up my mail because I drank coffee today. I'm recalling the need to go and check my mail without actually experiencing the mailbox. But then I have a recollection, a memory of yesterday that was triggered because of some qualia and some cognitions, right? So it might not be absolutely simple, but there might be sort of a little, off road and then back on track. But at the end of the day, it is all ultimately, even for memory, based on qualia and cognitions. An exception to this might be that, for instance, art, and that might be particular why art is something that people like. It is usually or mostly, if not only, based on qualia. It's my experience of sounds. The sounds might be ordered in a particular structure and so on, but I'm just enjoying the sound. I'm not cognizing anything within the sound. That might be slightly different if you have visual arts, like a movie or painting or things like that, right? So you can go from qualia to abstractions without having a cognition, but you can't have an abstraction without ultimately there having been at least a qualia and maybe also a cognition. I hope I'm not forgetting something here, right? And one way to check whether, for me at least, whether or not some phenomena is a qualia or a cognition, it's not really that difficult. Is it a color? Is it a sound? Is it smell, touch, and taste? That seems very easy. And that's also why I really, really, really am happy that I've ended up with qualia as the starting point, right? Because it's irrefutable. It's like you can't be confused about what a color is, right? I mean, how could you? It's a gray area, with a color, right? It's a gray, yeah, the color gray, right? And elephant, beaver, apple, it's just either you're experiencing elephant or you're not experiencing elephant, right? It's a really good approach, this. It's not to bang my own drum here or anything like that. It's just so satisfying that it's so easy and approachable. There might be need for a lot of work down here in abstractions, but because they are not necessary for all the further steps in my philosophy, I leave them here in this category and say bye-bye. I don't need you anymore, right? These are particular to me because they are my abstraction. They are purely my abstractions because they are dependent on the two others and they are part of me. If they are then dependent on these things that are part of me, this third category can only ever be a part of me and nothing else. I'm not saying somebody else, if I get down the road and I establish the idea of another individual that I say can have the possible same pain as me. Yes, but I can never agree on it. Because their pain, if we're talking about their pain, is particular to them. I can't experience their pain because I need qualia of the pain and I don't have that. Right? So that's why everything else is chopped down in abstractions, and these abstractions are everything else but qualia and cognitions because they are all dependent on them. See, this is a very, very simple and effective approach to ontology, in my opinion, because you get rid of all that could potentially fuck the rest of your philosophy up and make it bloated and inflated and cumbersome and so on, right? I haven't done this because I needed to be like that. I identified that you could do it this way, and it makes perfect sense to me. I don't think there are any holes here. It's because it's so simple. It's easy to check whether or not there's a problem. But if you have a fucking diagram with 36 interdependent, interconnected, whatever, how you would lose overview, right? So this works in my opinion. But please let me know if you find some flaws in this. Please scrutinize it. Please give me your comments. Please, please, please. I mean, I have about 600 listeners now, right? Or subs. Subscribers, that's the term I was looking for before. Please give me your comment, right? Show yourself. Show me that you care for this. At least say, hi, I'm here, I'm checking it, but I don't have time, whatever, right? Just show yourself. Please, wouldn't you? And give me a like, give me a subscribe if you haven't done so already. Consider joining the board, links below, and you can go back in my history, in my my feed here, and find older videos on my philosophy, and not least a lot of criticism of Bernardo Castro, which I've done a lot, and I'm winding down my criticism. And he has seemingly winded down his appearance all over the place in podcasts and videos. I have not seen many in the last, maybe in the last year or so. I haven't seen much from him, right? So I think he's sort of, I have done my philosophy. I don't need to explain it anymore, right? So you just obey, right? And he's a weird character. He is a weird character, right? Okay. I think I've said what I need to say about my ontology, but please give me some comments and I'll be happy to answer them. Just take it seriously and, be discreet about it, and I'll take all the time we need, right? And if you have seen a flaw in this, please illuminate me, because I don't want to have flaws in my philosophy. So please help me out, right? Help a brother out, as they say. Okay, well, we are approaching the 1 hour mark. I like to keep my videos below the 1 hour. So in 2 minutes, we are reaching the 1 hour mark. So I'll better stop now, right? So can you have a nice day, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.